Hi, Mystery Recapped here. Today, I'm going to explain a sci-fi thriller movie called The Man from Earth. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie opens as a professor of history, Dr. John Oldman, packs his belongings onto a truck. He is preparing to move to a new town after having stayed in this one for the past decade. He is almost done when suddenly several of his colleagues show up. From John's reaction, it is obvious that he wasn't expecting them to be here. He hadn't even told anyone that he was moving away.
No, we're all here to see your wife.
Nonetheless, they reveal that they are here to give him a farewell party. Dan, who teaches anthropology in the same college, is particularly baffled. He is confused as to why John is leaving such a great career behind after just 10 years. Another colleague, Edith, an art history professor, brings up the fact that John hasn't even aged a bit in all this time. All the people gathered at the farewell want to know the secrets, why he hasn't aged, and why he wants to move away. The answer to both is the same. He's been adrenochroming. But John simply replies that he likes to shake up his life every now and then. Now that everyone is gathered, John invites them inside his ex-house, which is empty save for a couch. Dan soon finds a rather fascinating thing among John's possessions. He sees a chisel-shaped object and deduces that it looks like an ancient carving stone. He shows it to Art, an archaeologist by profession, and the latter confirms his guess. In fact, the stone seems to be from around 12,000 years ago, belonging to the Magdalenian culture of the Upper Paleolithic era. As the afternoon passes by, the gathered crowd of friends tell John that if he has anything to say, they are all ready to hear it. The history professor thinks for a while and replies that he indeed has something to tell them all. He then asks them a silly, hypothetical question. What if a man from the Upper Paleolithic era survives until the present day and never dies? Almost immediately, Harry, who is a biologist, says a normal human body is designed to live for 190 years. An ideal human body that functions perfectly and regenerates cells perfectly can live for thousands of years or even longer. Harry further says that many things are possible, even if we do not have knowledge about it currently. After all, there was a time when Columbus went to find a new route to India, and everyone called him a madman. There's a slight difference between getting on a boat and living for eternity, but we'll give him a pass. Upon hearing this, John decides to reveal his secret identity to his friends. He boldly claims that he once sailed with Columbus. Everyone was pretty sure that the Earth was flat during those days. In fact, he too thought that their ship might fall from the edge of the Earth at some point. John's colleagues look extremely surprised by his strange statements. The history professor then adds that he is actually from the Paleolithic era. To break the tension in the room, he makes a caveman-like grunting noise, and everyone starts laughing.
Oh, we get it, John. You're just stupid.
Sandy, a junior historian who had gone to the kitchen, comes back and asks what happened. Harry jokingly replies that John is claiming to be 14,000 years old. Rather obviously, she doesn't believe his story and tells him to stop joking around, but everyone finds the whole thing interesting and wants to listen more. John continues that every 10 years or so, people would start to notice that he doesn't age. So he moves on and goes to a different place to start a new life. In the first part of his life, he aged only until about 35 years, but ended up leaving his tribe. Everyone around him saw that he never aged and thought he was stealing their lives to stay young. Furthermore, he says that the first 2,000 years were cold. With time, the glaciers started melting and the sea started to get visible, eventually separating the land into different continents. Arts, who is carefully listening to this, points out that these are all basic things that everyone learns in science books. John agrees and says he was able to recollect his memories through such books. Without them, it is impossible to remember every detail for the past 14,000 years. Linda, an archaeology student, then asks if John was ever curious where we all came from. The latter replies that during the early part of his life, he would look up at the sky and wonder if there's some man up there controlling the universe. After this, John's colleagues start asking him many questions, and he keeps answering all of them. Then, one of them inquires why he's telling them all this after keeping it a secret for 14,000 years. John earnestly replies that he wanted to say goodbye as himself and not what they thought he was.
Besides, after dinner, I'm going to kill you all.
Suddenly, Linda wonders how come he doesn't remember where he was born born exactly? John has a simple answer to this one. He migrated from plains to forests to mountains, tundra, canyons, and whatnot. But now, all of these have changed. Covered by freeways, buildings, and urban sprawl, there is no way he can bypass several millennia worth of change and simply remember the world as it was 14,000 years ago. As John keeps going with his recollection, his friends start to be divided into two groups. Most of them find his story amusing and in line with the actual history of the world. Art and Edith, on the other hand, start getting more and more irritated with the whole thing. The archaeologist thinks John is simply making up fables based on things he read in some books. Meanwhile, Edith gets worried that her longtime colleague is starting to lose it mentally. Despite the duo's protestations, is that a word? John continues and says that sometime later during his life, he headed to the east. The directions hadn't been named yet. He simply traveled towards the sun, thinking it might be warmer there. By the start of the Bronze Age, John had already gotten the hang of moving alone and fitting in where he wanted to. He followed the trade routes from the east, traded copper, and learned new languages as he went. Moving on was easier as a hunter-gatherer, but became difficult as villages merged and civilization grew. He had to learn some tricks to keep his gift hidden and even faked his death a couple of times. As centuries passed, he gradually continued moving east until he finally came to India. His arrival coincided with the presence of Buddha, whom John refers to as the most extraordinary man he's ever known. The Buddha taught him things that he never knew about before. John ended up staying and learning there until the great figure passed away. Moments later, another one of John's colleagues, Dr. Will Gruber, a psychiatry professor, arrives at the spot. The others quickly give him a brief explanation of everything they've heard. Will is an old man suffering from several health issues and sits down on the couch. He initially takes things at face value and starts asking questions through the lens of psychiatry. He inquires if John has ever been seriously ill in his enormous lifetime. The latter replies that in the last 100 years, he has had typhoid, yellow fever, smallpox, and even survived Black Plague. The obvious question arises: if he had smallpox, he would have scars on his body.
Show us your dick, John.
In response, John says that he is always healed completely and doesn't get scars. Harry, who is the only one with a funny bone in his body, jokingly asks what John does in his free time. But it is a good question, as having such a long lifespan would mean a lot of free time. John answers that he faps a lot, and he studied in his free time, which is why he has 10 doctorates over a span of the last 170 years. He says that he got his biology degree in 1840, but the knowledge was not so vast at that time. Upon hearing this, Will gets really irate and recalls a statement someone had told him earlier. Some of John's earliest tribe people feared that he was stealing their lives. Will asks if John knew for certain that he wasn't actually doing so through some unconscious magical power. After all, there have always been legends of vampires who drink the blood of humans and take their life. To everyone's utter horror, Will takes out his revolver and points it at John. He says that this will help him see if John actually dies or not. Never question an elementary school teacher. The latter quickly points out that he never said that he was immortal. Will insists, saying a shot to the arm will let them see whether he heals or not, but everyone urges him to drop the weapon, and Will eventually does so. He seems extremely flummoxed by the whole story and quickly leaves the house, saying he has work to do. Meanwhile, Art reveals that Will's wife passed away last night after a lengthy battle with cancer. This makes John feel bad, so he runs to the old man to apologize. He finds him not too far off from his home and offers his deepest condolences. Will seems to have calmed down a bit and leaves after handing John the revolver. The history professor later sees that there's no bullet in that gun, which amuses him. As soon as John comes back inside, everyone says that they want to hear more. Only Edith seems to be growing more and more worried about his mental health. John then tells them that he once met a man in the 1600s that he thought had the same gift as him. The two sat down and talked about their lives for 2 whole days. It was all pretty convincing, but they couldn't believe each other. Eventually, they parted their separate ways, agreeing to keep in touch. John recollects that 200 years later, he thought he saw the man at a train station in Brussels, but lost him in a crowd. This is when the conversation turns to everyone's favorite topic, religion. Dan asks if John is a religious person, and the latter says he isn't. John quotes French scholar Pierre-Simon Laplace and points out that he doesn't need any hypothesis about how the world came to be. Then Dan, who's totally hellbent to start a fight with his religion talks, asks if John has ever met any biblical figure. John John says, "I guess you weren't listening when I told you about my bender with Buddha." The mood in the room goes intense, and John cautiously says he has. But he asserts that they should skip this subject, as it's too controversial. Plus, he swore he would never tell anyone that he used to give Satan blowies. Everyone in the room is Christian, but some are more devout than the others. No one, however, believes in the Bible as deeply as Edith. Dan urges John to tell them about the early days of Christianity and how it started. The latter eventually gives in and drops a bombshell. He says that the entire Bible is mostly a myth and allegory, with some basis in historical events. This makes Edith really uncomfortable, but she doesn't say anything for the moment. Following this, John tells them that when he met Buddha, he was hugely influenced by the great man's view on life and suffering. When John eventually returned to the Mediterranean, the Roman Empire had already grown to unseen heights. He didn't like that the whole civilization had become a giant killing machine, so he went to the Near East, thinking that he should pass the Buddhist teachings in a modern form. Suddenly, Edith scoffs out loud, saying her colleague is claiming to be Jesus Christ. John doesn't deny this, but says Jesus was simply a human being who was forcefully made into a godlike figure. Although Edith seems gobsmacked by this, Dan tries to entertain the possibility and asks about the crucifixion. John says that he blocked the pain from his limbs through an ancient technique that he learned in India. He also learned how to slow his body process down to the point where they were undetectable. They thought he was dead, so his followers pulled him from the cross before hiding him in a cave. Eventually, John healed and his body slowly came back to normal condition. He attempted to go away undetected, but some devotees who were standing nearby saw him walk. He tried to explain to them, but they were ecstatic and too eager to believe in miracles. This is when Will comes back and apologizes for his behavior. The others catch him up to speed with the latest development in John's bullshit. Just imagine you visit a friend's house and he is casually claiming to be Jesus. Seeing poor Edith breaking down in front of everyone, Will intervenes and says this story must now come to an end. He is afraid that John needs some serious professional help. But in a rather dramatic fashion, John stands up and says that he was simply making up a story. He wanted to see how far he could stretch his false claim of being 14,000 years old. When his friends started asking questions, he began enjoying answering them, and the story kept growing. Everyone gets relieved, especially Edith, and soon they all leave for their homes, one by one. However, Sandy, who loves John, decides to stay back, and the duo leaves everyone on the front porch. It is revealed that Sandy still believes in whatever John said. She inquires how many times he has changed his name. The latter reveals that he has never changed his name, but shuffled between several surnames. About 60 years ago, when he was teaching at Harvard, his name was John Thomas Partry. Suddenly, Will, who was using the bathroom, overhears this conversation. He is shocked as John Thomas Partee was the name of his estranged father. Will approaches the duo and asks whether John taught chemistry at Harvard. The latter says he did, but Will still refuses to believe this. Then John tells him that his wife's mother's name was Nola. Will, who had never told anyone his mother's name, breaks down upon hearing this. John adds that when his and Nola's son was young, they had a pet dog named Wolfie. Will becomes very emotional as that was the name of his pet growing up. The shock of this revelation is so huge that the old man ends up passing away by heart attack.
That's a coincidence, says John.
Every time I tell people the truth, someone dies and it turns out I banged someone else's mom.
But it's rare that both happen to the same person.
The scene shifts to some time later as an ambulance carries Will's dead body away. Shortly afterwards, John climbs into his truck and drives to the road. Before he can leave, Sandy decides to join him for the rest of his journey. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.